Shalom, good evening. How's everybody doing?
Good, shalom.
Hey, Rob. Hey, Lisa. Hey, David. Hey, Ben. Hey, John. Hi, Ed and Lisa. Hi, Dahlia. Hi, Rocky and Hillary. It's awesome to see you all here. L'chaim, l'chaim. I don't know if the topic today was the sunniest topic, but it's been pretty amazing to have this, to get sight of the sun these last few days, huh? Isn't that nice? It was really, really nice. Even yesterday in the windy weather, we ran with the kids to the park and frolicked in the wind and the leaves and all the fallen tree branches. We had a great, great time. I want to say something. Yashikok to all of you who are able to keep your cameras on. It just gives such a human feel to be able to sit together and see each other. And hopefully if I provoke you enough tonight, you'll give me some feedback, you'll challenge, you'll question, and as we discuss this topic. Honestly, I was pretty worried about the topic tonight. I almost didn't want to give it. I didn't want to discuss this topic because I think you might know there's a long-standing tradition that there are three things you don't speak about when you're amongst pleasant company. Anybody know what they are? Three things? Feel free to unmute yourself if you know.
Politics, religion.
Politics, religion. What's the third one? And sports. Politics, religion, and sports. Three things you're not supposed to speak about in pleasant company. So we're going to break some of those rules tonight. And because there's no way of avoiding politics in the topic of our discussion. Now, I think most of you are pretty familiar. I see we lost one participant already. I think most of you might not be able to guess how I vote. And I think almost all of you, I mean, I could say for certain, all of you have never heard me speak in any kind of public setting about my personal political views.
Because you have a Canadian.
Oh, I'm a Canadian, exactly. I have no right to share my opinion. But by the way, David, I have dual citizenship. So I'm an American also. But I never speak. I consider myself an opinionated person, but I will never share my views in any kind of communal setting, congregational setting, because it will hurt our mission. It will hurt the mission of bringing Jewish people together around the things we do connect. And politics is just an area where there's going to be differences of opinion, and there's no way that we can all come together if we make politics, and I don't know so much about sports, but politics, we make that the subject of our discussion. So it's possible that when we're going to talk tonight, you might feel triggered, and I apologize. And I promise you, hey, Ed, it's so good to see you. I apologize if any of this is triggering. I don't mean to. And I guarantee you that based on what we discussed tonight, at the end of the class, you will still not know how I vote. But I just want to put that out there because at the end of the day, this is a Torah class. This is a Torah discussion that we're doing every week. We're discussing Torah ideas. And really, I try to avoid anything else that's external, that's not related. But it's important in order for us to drive the message home from a very powerful and actually to keep the message fresh, that you should all feel that this is something relatable that we can connect to. We're going to have to bring in current affairs, current events. And I realize that these things are very, very nuanced, and not necessarily everything we're going to show to build up our case is going to be in line with your views. And that's okay. Again, this is just, the point is not in that. The point is not the political views. The point is to be able to appreciate the Torah message even more. So 2 weeks ago, we started our course and we started schmoozing about what we can do to condition ourselves in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism, not to be anxious? What are things we can appreciate in that realm? Last week we spoke about what we can do in terms of targeting the claims of anti-Semitism, not internalizing it, but rather behaving in the best possible ways to deal with the situation based on the experiences with Haman, with Achashverosh, the different kinds of anti-Semitism. Today, we are going to talk about the mutations of anti-Semitism. We were dealing with COVID-19. COVID-19, we know it mutates in many ways. David is here on the call and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but something tells me that we're going to be having to deal with different mutations of this for years to come, unless Hashem decides to bless us with getting rid of this virus. But ultimately, these viruses, what happens is that you build up immunities against it, and then it comes back a little while later with another form, another way to attack you. And anti-Semitism does much of the same. It's interesting that in different generations, anti-Semitism manifested itself in different flavors. And once we become immune and society rejects that kind of anti-Semitism, it somehow manages to come back in another way. Let's read this text from Jonathan Sacks, page 84, text number 1, to get a little bit of a better picture about this. Jonathan Sacks says in his beautiful English, I think I've actually heard him say this orally as well in a speech that I watched once, but he says it like this. Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions, like we said last week. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in so doing, defeats the immune system set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. So listen to this. Most people at most times feel a residual guilt at hating the innocent. Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimation in the most prestigious source of authority at any given time. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. That's why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. So you think back in history, there was the kind of anti-Semitism that was very much connected with our faith and the way it contradicted other faiths. Think about the Crusaders, even the Cossacks. They were motivated quite religiously in their hatred towards the Jewish people and the damage that they inflicted. In the 19th century, religion had lost prestige and the supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudosciences: social Darwinism, the idea that in society as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race. We all know what that is and what that ended up with in the horror of the Holocaust. But by the late 20th century, science had lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth, right? We realized atomic bombs. We realized that science cannot be the be-all, end-all because it can also be used to hurt people and to kill people and to make weapons of mass destruction. So what happened? Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews or the Jewish state are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity. This is why we are going to today get into a thorny little topic, or not such a little topic, called Israel. Why do we have to get into Israel? Why is it a thorny topic? It's a nice little place in the Middle East. Well, the reality is that this small country, you all know, has attracted to itself such incredible criticism that many feel is anti-Semitic. Now, I know that some of you might be thinking that, the criticism of Israel is just criticism. It's not anti-Semitism. We also criticize Israel. There's definitely room for different perspectives. And I want to just reiterate that some of the things you might see, you might feel are framed in a different way than you're used to, or that they are triggering. And I apologize. I'm not trying to do that, but just to bring out a more fresh lesson, a fresh idea at the end, and that will not contradict your political beliefs. At the end, there is space in Judaism for people to have different political beliefs. That being said, let's take a look at the one body that spends a lot of time kvetching about Israel, the UN. And don't get me wrong, I don't think the UN is a bad place. The UN is a good concept. The idea that nations can come together and sit around the same table, probably.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
may I say something?
go ahead.
You don't need to apologize. You're not the one that makes the laws or the one that runs the government in Israel. It is what it is. So you don't need to apologize.
Right, of course. I'm not, did I apologize?
Yes, several times.
Okay, fine. I'm just trying to cushion before the blow comes. All right, so basically, the UN is really a good concept, but like all things made by humans, a lot of the things that made by humans can use some fine tuning, the UN included. So let's take a look at this video right over here. And let's get ourselves in a really depressing mood before we get into some fresh, positive ideas.
On the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah Wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2016 until 2020, the Assembly adopted 122 resolutions criticizing various countries. 91 of these targeted Israel. That's 75% of all country-specific resolutions. And while 3/4 of this global forum's written rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 40 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years before the Palestinian Liberation Organization even nominally forswore terrorism, the Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part in its deliberations. This was the first time that anyone who was neither a government representative nor a head of a quasi-state was granted such a privilege. The following year, the Assembly awarded the PLO permanent representative status. A few months later, the UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories, is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to May 2021, Israel was condemned in no less than 94 Human Rights Council resolutions. During the same period, Syria was condemned 36 times, North Korea 14 times, and China has been spared condemnation altogether. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment at the UN.
There are some bias against Israeli people and government.
In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
A disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
One of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, non? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not the. There's other really bad happening. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all of the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
Boy, it's intense, huh? I gotta say, criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitism. That's criticizing Israel. I believe each and every one of us may have areas where we believe that Israel could have done things differently. It's a human-run government, and it's run by its own set of laws. It's a modern state. It's not specifically guided by Torah or, principles above criticism. What bothers the problem with this criticism of Israel in the UN is when it becomes a double standard in terms of our discussion tonight. And this is, unfortunately, what seems to be a terrible part of the whole package of the UN, which is theoretically a good concept. You know, this is not the first time that anti-Semitism has manifested itself in a set of double set of standards. Take a look at this. This is mind-blowing. In the Medrash, text number 2, page 88, about a fellow who wrote a letter to Emperor Hadrian with very similar lines. His name was Imi Cantrum. We don't know exactly who he is. It's speculated that he was a Roman noble of Roman nobility of some sort. And he writes like this to Emperor Hadrian. If it is circumcision that you hate, and by the way, Emperor Hadrian set a whole bunch of laws in Israel, trying to wipe out Jewish practice. So Imi Cantrum writes to Emperor Hadrian, if it is circumcision that you hate, Arabian tribes also circumcised. And if it is Shabbat observance that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbat. That's another sect or another religion that was very similar to Judaism. Clearly, then, you simply hate the Jewish people. Their God will exact punishment from you. What's Imi Cantrum telling him? He's telling him, you're just a hater. You're a hater, and you're trying to express your hate into some sort of explainable terms. So you decide that you can't stand Shabbat. You think it's lazy to take a day of rest, and you think that circumcision is abhorrent. But if that really what was concerned you, there are other nations, other minorities in your kingdom that also have similar practices, and you're not going out against them. We got to tell a joke because it's been very serious so far. All right, so hopefully this is funny. So basically, there's a few folks that are captured by terrorists. There was an American reporter, there was a BBC reporter, a British reporter, and an Israeli soldier. That's some zone of conflict. All three of them are captured by terrorists, and they're about to be put to death, and they're given their last wish. So they ask the American, what's your last wish? The American says, I would love to have one last burger and fries before I die. The BBC reporter says, please just let me film and record until the end so that one day if this videotape is found, my family will see that I was true to my hobby, to my passion about reporting till the very end. And they turn to the Israeli and they say, no, hotshot, what do you want? He says, I want you to kick me. To kick you? You're making a joke out of us? Be happy we're giving you a lot of... No, kick me hard. Okay. Fine, this guy's really crazy. So the terrorist pulls back and kicks him really hard, sends him flying. Meanwhile, the Israeli on the ground pulls out a pistol from somewhere on his body, starts shooting the terrorist. The other terrorists nearby are so confused. Meanwhile, the Israeli grabs some of the weapons that the terrorist had dropped, and he wipes out all the terrorists over there, and he starts letting the other two captives free. And the American reporter and the BBC reporter, they're shocked. And they said, why did you wait so long to do this? Well, I mean, if you could have done this, you could have done this earlier. He says, what? And have you report that I was the aggressor? So he had to wait until he was, so to speak, attacked first, right? It's a joke. It's a joke. But truly, this is the experience that we see in the media a lot, that it just seems unfair, the amount of times that Israel is considered to be treating others poorly when no mention is made of the terror that lies within their midst. And instead, what Israel likes to do is they don't want to be criticized in the public sphere. They don't want to be so called out. So they try to wait until they're victims first, which, by the way, means that they're dead people, they're dead Jews, before they can defend themselves. They like to do that. One time they didn't do that. The one time they didn't do that was the 6-Day War. They wanted to, but thank God, whoever was running the game, I think it was God, but decided that somehow got the message out that they should be proactive. And there was almost no casualties during that war in terms of what, innocent loss of life. But in the Yom Kippur War, I wasn't around, but many of you were, the Israelis waited, even though they knew things were brewing, they waited until they waited until they were attacked, and then they started going to battle. So this way, so to speak, the international community shouldn't criticize them and should have their back. Unfortunately, the Yom Kippur War, they did end up winning, or if you want to call that winning, but some terrible, terrible losses along the way. There is the problem. The problem when Israel criticism becomes anti-Semitism is when it's not just regular criticism, double standards or demonization. Actually, there was a fellow named Natan Sharansky. We spoke about him in previous classes, a refusenik that made it to Israel. He set up, so to speak, a code, a barometer that you could see. Is this anti-Israel criticism or is it anti-Semitism? It's called the 3D test, 3Ds: demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. Join me on page 89. This is from Natan Sharansky's book, page 89, text 3. I believe that we can apply a simple test. I call it the 3D test to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The first D is the test of demonization. When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis and between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. Do me a favor. To go that far just seems like unfair demonization, especially if you consider what's going on around the world and how careful and sensitive Israel tries to be a lot of the time. The second D is the test of double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of known and major abusers such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria is ignored. I hope we don't get thrown off the Zoom conference for criticizing China. When Israel's Magen David Avdom, alone among the world's ambulance services, is denied admission to the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. Now, by the way, he wrote this before the Magen David Adom, which is Israelis' ambulance service, was allowed into the Red Cross, but now they are part of the International Red Cross. So thank God there is some good news to report about. The third D is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied alone among all peoples in the world, this too is anti-Semitism. Now, this is not news, and some of you may not agree with this set of double standards, but I think what we can say is that there's a disproportionate amount of anti-Jewish things coming as a result of criticism of Israel. And this is not the point of the class. I promise you. So if you're already offended, or if this is hard to hear, I'm just hang in there. We're almost there. We're almost at the refreshing, positive part, the leg out of the situation. Bottom line is, when many anti-Israel organizations attack Israel, what do they do to legitimize themselves? Hi, Rocky. Good to see you. What do they do to legitimize themselves? Many, many times they will say, well, we have Jewish people amongst our ranks and our staff, so how could we be anti-Semitic? And this worries a lot of Jewish people for a good reason, especially Bubby's and Zadie's parents. They see their kids getting caught up in an anti-Israel, what's the word? Into another rage. But they're getting into this just like this crazy anti-Israel. It's not just regular criticism, to the point that you can see tragic videos of Jewish people protesting alongside pro-Palestinian supporters from the river to the sea. Palestine should be free. Now, do you know what those words mean? I don't think they know what they mean. That's why they're saying it. They don't realize what that means. From the river to the sea means essentially to make Israel Judenrein. That there's another nation that tried to do that, to wipe out Jews. But I'm going to talk about the fact that why in the world would it make sense for any country to not allow certain kinds of people to live there, which is what Palestinians want. They want a place where they can assert control and not have anybody else live there. I mean, anybody can live in America. Anybody can live in any country. Maybe you have a process of citizenship, but we're not even going to talk about that because for the sake of our discussion and for the sake of our argument. But it's clear that if Jewish people are in those protests, in those marches, criticism of Israel is okay, but to that degree, that level of statement against Israel, and there are Jewish people there, which is how these anti-Israel organizations protect themselves, there's got to be something that's not right. First of all, they must clearly not understand what they're saying and the ramifications of what that means. So how could this happen? Many will answer, the problem here is assimilation. Now, assimilation, if you're the more disconnected you are, the so to speak, the easier it is for you to get caught up in a rage against Israel to that degree. Now, I want to challenge that. I'm not saying that's wrong, but the challenge to that is there are many parents that take their kids to Israel, that send their kids to Hebrew school even, where they've learned about Israel. They were proud of Israel in the house as kids, when they had kids in the house. And their kids, for some reason, sometimes end up still in these anti-Israel movement. Why is that happening? Now, there's three reasons, usually, common arguments in Israel education. There's three common reasons that most pro-Israel organizations, if you do some research, take a look at Stand With Us, at AIPAC, at the different organizations that are out there, the three reasons they tend to go to of the legitimization, why is Israel legitimate? There are three general reasons that they go to. So let's talk about three of those reasons as we reflect on the fact that there's still youth that have been exposed to pro-Israel education, be it at home, be it in trips to Israel, be it in their Hebrew school, in their temple Hebrew schools, that are getting caught up in this. Let us reflect on what are the reasons that most children are being taught to be pro-Israel. And then we're going to talk about counter arguments, and then we're going to get to some cool stuff. So what are the three most common arguments? The first of the most common arguments that a pro-Israel organization would give of why is Israel a legitimate state is international law. You, the UN, you yourselves established Israel. First was in 1917, the League of Nations got together, and there was the Balfour Declaration. A fellow named Mr. Balfour, who read this, declared that it was within His Majesty's favor to establish this state of land, and later on, this mandate that he gave ended up becoming confirmed in the United Nations, 1947, 1948, and ultimately there was two states set up, an Israel state and an Arab state, and therefore, by international law, by the very rules that dictate that our countries have to go by, Israel has a legitimacy to exist, because in the 1917 and 1947, 1948, those votes affirmed, and the entire world agreed that Israel has a right to exist. Is this good enough? We'll see. Let's see. Well, if that's not good enough, there's another very powerful reason of why it's important to be pro-Israel that most pro-Israel organizations give. Jewish survival. Jewish survival. We have been hounded for so many years. The climax, perhaps, was the time of the Holocaust, where millions were being murdered in Germany, and it's still ongoing, and then was ongoing in Russia as well. A terrible, terrible blows against the Jewish people from every side. For 2,000 years, we've been hounded since the destruction of the Second Holy Temple. And we are people that were weakened by not having a state. But by having a state to go to where we could fend for ourselves, have our own air force and army to protect ourselves, to celebrate and live in peace amongst each other, is key for Jewish survival. Is that good enough? Let's see. Now, a third argument that's given for the land of Israel is history. Historically, Jewish people have lived in the land of Israel for thousands and thousands of years, for over 3,000 years. We got there after Mount Sinai, and we settled there, and we built 2 holy temples. Yes, we left for about 70 years, but we came back, and we built the second holy temple. And for all time, since the Jewish people came to the land of Israel with Joshua, after the times of Moses, there has always been Jewish people living in Israel. Sometimes it was down to about 10,000, a few thousand Jewish people, but there was always a Jewish presence. Judaism in Israel was something that was always pretty prominent. Israel was always a center of Torah. If you look throughout the ages, whether it be Talmudic times, be it post-Talmudic times, be it in the times of the Rambam, times when we were in a lot of places, but Israel was always a center of Torah. And even when we weren't in Israel, Jewish people, we yearn for Israel, we pray for Israel, we sing for Israel. It's always primary in our focus. And truly, we are the indigenous people to Israel. We've been there for so long. Which other nation in the world can really, honestly, legitimately say that they have been in that place for that many thousands of years? Very few can say that for thousands of years they can document how long they have been in a place. These are three arguments that most pro-Israel organizations go to. And they're strong. They each have their strengths. Now, I have to tell you, though, that each one of these three are often presented with counter-arguments, especially by the youth of today that are caught up in anti-Israel movements. So let's talk about some counter-arguments. The first one we talked about is international law. What's the problem with the argument of international law being legitimate, being the case to legitimize Israel? First of all, the same international law that's legitimizing Israel, it's almost like delegitimizing Israel. I mean, Mr. Balfour said yes, and Mr. whoever in the UN now is saying no. If that's what we're based upon, that isn't so solid. And second of all, if that is what it is, it's very unappealing, because for many young people that were raised in a society that tikkun olam, fixing the world, is what's key, being kind and loving. If they see that the reason why Israel's statehood is important to them is connected to colonialism, that is a big turnoff. Take a look at this, written by a Jewish young woman who is very anti-Israel, and see what she writes about her own pro-Israel education. She was raised with pro-Israel values. Take a look at this, page 94, text number 5. When I was a Jewish kid growing up in suburban Los Angeles, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel. There really wasn't a choice. If you identified as Jewish, as I and most of my friends did, the religious education we got, the youth groups we joined, and the summer camps where we played were all grounded in one thing. It wasn't God, it was Zionism, the political project of settling Jewish people in Israel. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodore Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, the leader of British land theft in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial, Herzl assured Rhodes. So this Jewish kid learns about Tikkun Olam. We're supposed to be kind and loving people. And you tell them Israel is so important. And then you find out that Israel was established in a colonial way. That's evil. Colonialism is evil. There's a fellow named Seth Rogen. You may know him. He's very open about it. He talks very openly about his Jewish education and his very anti-Israel stances. So many young people are, even though they've been exposed to pro-Israel values, they've been exposed to being schlepped to Israel for bar mitzvahs and to supporting the JNF, planting trees, Israel songs and Israeli dancing in summer camps. It hasn't been enough to get them past the fad of the day, which is criticizing Israel. So international law alone doesn't make a very strong argument when these other challenges come up. Jewish survival. Let's take Jewish survival to the task. On one hand, you could say statehood is so helpful for Jewish survival. On the other hand, we've survived by being dispersed across the world. It almost seems like the greatest liability to put millions and millions of Jewish people in one spot. I mean, think about the terror threats from Iran, right? Why are we so nervous about it? Because you have 9 million Jewish people living in one tiny area. It almost seems the opposite, counterintuitive for Jewish survival. For Jewish survival, we should be spread out across the world. Also, for that, why do you need Israel? Go to a safer spot. Take a big chunk of the rural counties in Washington state, which barely have any people in it anyways, and set up a Jewish state over there. Or truthfully, back when Theodore Herzl was trying to work on setting up a state of Israel, he was offered Uganda. And Uganda back in that day, before all the development that's gone on in Israel, Uganda was a much better place. There was more oil there, more resources. Israel was actually in really bad shape when they took it. Why Israel? If the case is Jewish survival. And you're not getting anybody mad in Uganda. I mean, maybe you'll get some people mad, but not to the degree that you would think to what's going on in the Middle East. History. What about the argument of history? The problem with history is it's a strong argument. It is a strong argument. we're indigenous to the land of Israel. On the other hand, the problem with this argument is that the reality is, and I know we live in an area in our culture here, we are very conscious and aware of the misdeeds that happened when we came to this country, and we're very sensitive to the needs of Native people, and there are even Native reservations. But the reality is, the U.S. is never going to hand back the keys and give over the land to the natives entirely. So maybe there'll be small reservations, bigger reservations. The reality is, no country is going and giving back their land to the people that had it before. They're not giving New York back to the Dutch, and they're not giving back other countries to their previous owners. Even though Israel, there have been Jews living in Israel for a very long time, to come in 1948 and to make a state where there are other people living and to move other people out, history alone doesn't seem to justify that argument. Also, if you really want to go down that path, we all know that the Canaanites were there before. So we have an issue. These three big arguments that most pro-Israel organizations deal with, they have a little bit of a weakness in them. So this Israel issue, it's a very important one. It is a very important one. And Israel is very important to us as Jewish people. And it's important, even though this is not a very pleasant topic to deal with political issues. And I apologize again if there's nuances that are not pleasant for you to hear. The point of this all is to really deal with our relationship with the land of Israel. What can we do about this? The fact that there seems to be a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment, a lot of anti-Semitism, evil towards the Jewish people that's coming as a result of this modern state of Israel. So I want to tell you a story. There was one time a fellow who wrote to the Rabbi in the 50s, 60s, a letter. He is so disturbed. You know why? He was in shul, he was in the synagogue, and I saw a guy comes in for services, but instead of services, he sat and read the newspaper in the shul. What inappropriate behavior in a synagogue. And he wanted that the Rebbe should help him with rebuking this fellow. So the Rebbe turned the table on it. He said, if you see somebody in shul holding a newspaper, chances are the reason why he's reading a newspaper is because he doesn't know how to daven. He doesn't know how to pray. Be happy that he's in shul. It's so much more comfortable for him to go to the coffee shop. Why in the world is he in shul? He's crazy for being in shul and reading a newspaper. He doesn't know how to pray. Why would he come to shul? He came to shul because something was sending him there. If you see somebody that doesn't know how to behave in shul, doesn't know how one should be in a synagogue, it's your obligation to see what you can do to help them. Ask them if you can meet up to start studying the Aleph Bet once a week, to help them read Hebrew, or to teach them that it's okay to read the prayer book in English. So when we see a generation that is increasingly unromantic with Israel, a generation of Jews that is not very entranced by Israel, we need to see what's going on and to see what we can do. So I know that many of you have been in former classes with us and will know what I'm about to say. The Jewish view of why Israel is important to us is because of a biblical promise to the Jewish people. The real and the only real reason I think that one can stand by the state of Israel beyond all arguments is that God promised Israel to the Jewish people. That's our connection. Now, if you want somebody to grow up and to care about that, they have to be aware of this gift from God to the Jewish people as a young child. In other words, in order to appreciate the fact that Israel's relevance to us is because it's God-given, we need to, first of all, appreciate God. We need to be able to appreciate Judaism. We need to have an appreciation and respect to the Torah. If all of that is not there, and I'm going to come and meet you at an anti-Israel rally, and I'll say, my dear Jewish friend, don't you know that God promised us Israel in the Torah? It's not going to talk to him, right? But in order for a new generation not to be raised hating ourselves, hating Israel, we need to establish why Israel is really important to us. The other things we said before, they're nice, but in the Jewish view, most critical and paramount is our connection to Israel is because God said that this is going to be a Jewish homeland. This is going to belong to the Jewish people. And in order for us to appreciate that, and the reason why any of us are here at this class is because we have some sort of respect to God, to Torah, to Jewish values. We have some sort of respect and a good place in our heart for it. Now, for us to come to that on our own, that's hard. It's easiest and most successful when, as young children, we are raised to love and to be passionate about our Judaism. Can you imagine if you are raised with Judaism, with a Judaism that consists only of fasting on Yom Kippur, and now you're supposed to be passionate about this religion, and you're supposed to stand up for Israel? This is so unappealing. I'm passionate about a religion that's only about fasting one day a year because there are many Jewish people, that's the only day they go to synagogue is Yom Kippur. Well, how exciting of a religion is that for their kids? But if children are raised with the richness, with the joy of Judaism, with the values of love and kindness and ethics, the joys of Hanukkah, the joys of Shabbat, the mindfulness of kosher, the mindfulness of Jewish meditation, of spirituality. When Judaism means something to you, then you'll be able to listen to the messages of the Torah and it will hit home with you. Here's what's really mind-blowing. In the Torah, the very first verse of the Torah talks about creation. And Rashi, the widely accepted, simple commentary on the Torah, makes a comment. And his comment is geared towards a 5-year-old child. How do I know that? Because Rashi writes multiple times in his commentary that I wrote this in order for it to be understood, to deal with the questions that a 5-year-old can appreciate. A 5-year-old that's simply learning the Bible stories. What kind of questions will they have? That's what Rashi deals with. And you know what Rashi says in his first comment? Text number 6. The opening comment on the Torah, page 95, text number 6. Rashi says, what do we tell a child? What do we tell a child? Take a look at this. Rabbi Yitzchak stated, this is all wrong. The Torah should have begun with the first mitzvah, commanded to the Jewish people, which is contained in the verse. This month shall be to you, etc. For what purpose does it start with, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth? The Torah is a book of law. Why don't you start from the first law? The first mitzvah was when we received was to make a Jewish calendar when we came out of Egypt. Instead, we're telling Bible stories for the first book and a half of the 5 books of Moses. Rashi says the solution is found in the verse. He recounted the strength of his works to his people to give them the inheritance of nations. What does that mean? In other words, if the nations of the world accuse the Jews with the claim, you are thieves for having conquered the lands of the 7 nations. Sounds familiar? The Jews should reply, the entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whomever he desired. It was his will to initially give it to the 7 nations, and it was his will to subsequently remove it from them and give it to us. Our youth are not, they're not blind, they're not deaf, they're not stupid. They saw that we came in and conquered this land. And the only reason it makes sense for us to stay there is if we recognize that the only right we have to it is because God gave it to us. God said in the Bible that he will give this land to the Jewish people. And therefore we have a right to be there. You're right. It's not nice to go steal someone else's land, to move in with your people, even if you used to live there a long time ago. And it may not be the most strategic thing, naturally. It may not be sanctioned by international law, depending on how the tables turn. But God is the one who decides where we belong. And God decided that Israel should be a homeland for the Jewish people. That is our connection to Israel. So what's a good counter argument to this? What's a good counter argument to this comment? That the Torah starts with the creation of the world, so that I should expound a little bit more. The Torah starts with the story of creation and goes through history so that we learn about Abraham and we learn about God promising Israel to Abraham. The reason why we have to go through this whole chain of events is so that should it ever come a time that people are challenging Jewish people's connection to Israel, they should be able to say that the reason why we have a connection to it is because God gave it to us. What's the counter argument to that? You know what the counter argument is? God took it away. After the Second Holy Temple, we were exiled. Clearly, we weren't supposed to be there anymore. Other nations came and lived there. The answer to that is text number 7, page 97. God told Abraham, it's a process. Raise your eyes and look around from where you are, to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. Forever. That last word is key. In Hebrew, it's ad olam, which means forever. That means Jewish people have a connection to this land forever. It doesn't say only when you have your government, or only when you have an air force, or only when you have an army. It doesn't say only when there's a UN vote. It doesn't say only when it's strategic. Jewish people always have a connection to the land, even when you don't live there. It's always connected to you because that is what God told Abraham. So the key to being able to deal with our own getting caught up in anti-Israel movements, which in turn empowers those who cloak their anti-Israel sentiment, their anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment, is by giving them Judaism. Chances are that most times, if somebody is marching in an anti-Israel protest, screaming from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, they have not had a matzah ball or a challah in a long time. They probably haven't had Kiddush grape juice in a long time. So if I were to bump into those folks, which I do because this is Olympia, you know what I do? I don't talk about Israel. I don't care. I don't care what you think about Israel. I want you to come to my house for some vegan challah. Come to my house for Kiddush, to light the candles. Come for Hanukkah. Because if you don't have, chances are, 99% chance, that if you are marching in this level of a pro-Palestinian protest, I'm not saying Israel's above criticism, but if you are marching with those kind of vibes around you, chances are you haven't been involved in the warmth and the positivity of Judaism in a very long time. You must be on a journey somewhere else, and it probably doesn't resonate with you, the warmth and the positivity of Judaism. If a person, all I want them to come do is to come and eat matzah ball soup with me, even without the chicken, to come and eat challah, warm challah with me, have a good Shabbos meal, study Torah with me, and let yourself draw their own conclusions. It's impossible for a person to study Torah from a place of respect and not have some level of affection, some level of connection to the land of Israel. I'm not saying that, therefore, a person is going to be entirely pro-Netanyahu or pro the right wing or pro a certain level of government. That there's room for criticism, and there could be different political parties, even if you celebrate your Judaism. But this level, the level that empowers anti-Semitism, it comes from a lack of connection to our own heritage, a lack of being saturated, of being absorbed, immersed in our own heritage. It's like, imagine you give somebody a credit card and you tell them that this credit card has millions of, sorry, not a credit card, no credit cards, debit cards. Imagine you give somebody a debit card and say there's millions of dollars in the bank account attached to this debit card. It's all yours, but you don't show the person how it works, that you slip the card into the machine in order to be able to access your account. If you don't show them how to use the credit card, they'll never be able to access that wealth. It will be just a meaningless piece of plastic. And if somebody's Yiddishkeit to them is not shown, it's not rich, it's not full of warmth and positivity, then they won't know how to access it. And you could end up in a spot where you have people who are of Jewish birth, of Jewish identity, who are getting behind really, really almost anti-Semitic claims. And like I said, reiterate, I'm not saying Israel's above criticism, but to the extreme, the demonization, the double standards, the delegitimization comes from the fact that Jewish people can get behind it. It comes because there's not enough matzo ball soup in their system. There's not enough gefilte fish in their system. There's not enough Kiddush, not enough Shabbat, not enough Hanukkah, not enough joyful Jewish experience. The more we accept each other with love, we invite our Jewish friends in, and we celebrate, we will be able to make Jewish people aware of their connection to the land of Israel. I'm not even going to talk about the state, just about the fact that do we as citizens have a God-given right to live there? We're not going to talk about the state of Israel, just how do we as Jewish people have a connection to the land? Definitely needs some warm connection to Judaism. Israel themselves, back in the beginning, they were so secular, the Israeli government, they didn't want to hear this claim. Take a look at this, text number 8. We are on page 98. The Rebbe is talking about in a talk from, it's in a letter. It's in a letter to President of Israel, then President of Israel, Zalman Shazar. You may have heard of him. He was one of the earlier presidents of the land of Israel. He's actually from a Chabad background, but he was very secular. He did have a warm connection with the Rebbe. Now, the Rebbe says like this. Listen to this. They're almost prophetic. I have received complaints. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, and the covenant with Abraham in connection with modern Israel? Why do I mix God into the picture? After all, they say, those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authorized representatives, they all proclaim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. If you're familiar with the subject, you'll understand this already. But if you're not, I'll just put it this way. The Zionists that revolutionized the state of Israel mostly were pretty anti-religious. They were secular. Okay, so they, in the beginning years of government, they were not excited about the biblical connection. They were thrilled about the United Nations recognizing it. My answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No new entity was created in 1948. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. An entity established in 1948 based on the agreement or authorizations of the nation of the world has no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to claim you are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others. This is a claim that's already been raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, the United Nations, and some Jews as well. Even then, in the 50s and 60s, there was a small group of Jews, they called themselves the Canaanites, that got behind some idea that the Jewish people don't have a right to the state of Israel. This is why it's so crucial to underscore that this is our God-given homeland. Now, I do not delude myself into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, etc. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth. Listen to what the Rebbe is saying. Living in the Holy Land, including those serving in the IDF, for Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well. Now, the Rebbe is basically saying, you might have a hard time one day getting young Israelis to serve in the IDF if they don't realize that there's a biblical connection. Because if it's all about statehood, if it's all about colonialism, so to speak, then there might come a time when that doesn't speak to the youth. And if it's all about survival and it's all about the history, there might be times when that doesn't speak to the youth. But if the youth is raised with a warm connection to their Jewish heritage and recognition that the biblical promise of the land of Israel to the Jewish people is what gives us a right to be engaged over there, that is what can affect our eternal connection, our positive view in our own minds. So, receivers are keepers. The receivers are keepers. If we are receivers of the land from God, we keep it. It's a Torah class, so let's go a little deeper. This Rashi, this commentary about why Israel, what we do if people accuse us that Israel is stolen. We should know that God gave it to us. Why do we need a piece of land in the first place? Why do we need to be connected to a piece of land, a geographic location, which, by the way, is an issue that people bring up about the land of Israel? What makes you an American? What makes anybody an American? If you were born in the USA, or your parents were born in the USA, there's a connection to land. What makes you Canadian? If you have a connection to the land, if you were born in that land, in those borders, doesn't make a difference to you what happened with your parents. If you were born on Canadian soil or on American soil, you are of that nationality. What makes a person a Jew? Not if you were born in Israel. You could be from anywhere in the world, and you could be Jewish, right? Matter of fact, the founders of the state of Israel, funny enough, were not from the land of Israel. They were all European born for the most part. What makes a Jew? This is it becomes an issue for us because you don't have to be Jewish. You don't have to have Israel in order to be Jewish. Judaism is a spiritual state. Rabbi Sajak in text number 9, joining text number 9, he says like this: the Jewish nation is only a nation through its Torah. Our connection to the Bible is what makes us Jewish. As a matter of fact, do you know which country we became a nation in? Egypt. We got the Torah on Mount Sinai. Doesn't sound like Israel to me. And Moses, the man who led us out of there, didn't even make it to Israel. Why do we need this piece of land? Why are we making everybody crazy in the UN? We can be good Jews and live anywhere. The reason is, why do we need a connection to the land of Israel? And why is it important for us to recognize this within ourselves so that we cannot legitimize any anti-Semitic movements that are just a mutation, so anti-Israel movements that are mutations of anti-Semitism? Is because, I'll tell you why. Before we do, let's strengthen our question a little bit. Text number 10. An objective, unprejudiced survey of the long history of our people will at once bring to light the reality that our survival as a nation was not the result of material wealth or physical strength. Even during the most prosperous times under the united monarchy of King Solomon, the Jewish people as well as country were materially insignificant by comparison with contemporary world empires such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. Nor was our active statehood or the control of our geographic homeland that secured our existence, as is evidence from the reality that for the vast majority of our history, our people have lived in exile without a kingdom, without a homeland. The reality is we are so not dependent on Israel. We flourished for 2,000 years, mostly outside of Israel. Even Hebrew is not so important for us. Similarly, our Hebrew language did not play a vital role in our perpetuation. For even in biblical times, Aramaic supplanted the Holy Tongue in the spoken language to the extent that parts of the scripture, almost all of our Babylonian Talmud, the Zohar, and other key works were composed in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. Later in the times of Rabbi Sajak Gaon and Maimonides, most of the Jewish masses spoke Arabic, and further down the line, it was Yiddish and other languages. Go back a couple generations in your family. Your Jewish Bubbies and Zadis probably did not speak Hebrew. Maybe they read it and understood it. Most did not speak Hebrew well, especially the people that were poor. They didn't speak Hebrew. They spoke Yiddish, Russian, Polish. Maybe they were able to read the Siddur. But Hebrew is not critical for us being Jewish. As a matter of fact, when people come to shul and they don't know Hebrew, they say, I want to learn Hebrew. Most of the time I encourage people, just don't get stuck with reading Hebrew. First of all, start praying with it in English. God understands all languages. Hebrew is not critical for us as a nation. It is also impossible to ascribe any common secular culture or contemporary scientific knowledge as a major preservation factor for our people, right? It's not because we were doctors and lawyers that we've survived, right? Because now Jewish people are into tech, into Google and Facebook. Since such matters morphed radically from one era to another, the only remaining consideration, which is the sole factor that has remained consistent throughout the ages in all lands and under the full diversity of circumstances, is the Torah and mitzvot that the Jews have observed in their daily life with great self-sacrifice. So, why do we really need a land? Why are we making everybody Meshuggah? Join me in text number 11. Let's read this. The response to this is that the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is unique. It is not comparable to the relationship between any other nation and its homeland. Rather, the Jewish land is an integral part of the Jewish people's spiritual mission. The ultimate goal of the Jewish people's divine service is to turn this tangible world into a home for godly revelation. to the point that God's holiness dwells specifically in the physical reality of this world. For this reason, the majority of the Torah's commandments involve physical activities, so that the fulfillment of Torah mitzvot installs sanctity into tangible materials. Judaism is such a physical religion, right? We're not about, this Chabad is not organizing retreats to the Himalayan mountains or we can sit and meditate. We just aren't doing that. What we are doing is serving cholent now on Shabbat. I don't know if you saw the email, but beef stew is back. It was a victim of COVID-19, but now the cholent is back every Shabbat. Now, why are we so into the physical? I was talking about matzah ball soup. Why are we so into the material? Because Judaism is about making a difference in the world. And you know what the best expression of that is? Take a look at this. It was therefore critical to provide the Jews with the land of Israel, a physical land, and to provide them with an abundance of mitzvot that can be performed exclusively with this land. For this expresses the entire goal of the Jewish people and the purpose of the Torah, to conquer the physical dimension of the world and to transform it into a home for God. The ultimate expression of our mission to make this world a better place is by having a land that land itself is sacred entirely. And there's actually hundreds of mitzvahs that you can only do in Israel. So if you're going to be a passionate Jew, and if you're going to study the Torah, and you're going to be raised with Jewish values that are positive Jewish values, not just about fighting anti-Semitism, supporting Israel, and fasting on Yom Kippur, then you will find out that the Torah says that there's hundreds of mitzvahs that you can only do in Israel, agricultural and the like. These are things that only happen in Israel because there's actually a portion of the world that is super sacred. And that's in line with our mission of the world, that our connection to this world is not one where we try to get away from the physicality, but rather one where we try to embrace the world and make it into a more sacred place. So with that, we're going to wrap up today's discussion about Israel, about what we started off. We talked about the heavy criticism that comes upon Israel around the world, which seems to be another manifestation of anti-Semitism. And this is, of course, about anti-Semitism. So that's why we have to talk about it. But the real reason why we have to talk about it is to get to the bottom line. The bottom line is, if Jewish people are getting behind a movement that seems to be anti-Semitic, the reason is there isn't enough positive, joyful Jewish experience in their kishkas. They haven't been to a Hanukkah parade in a long time. They haven't had a great Jewish time. So the best thing we can do for this issue of anti-Semitism is by bringing joyful Jewish experience to our families. I know somebody who's on our call right now who made sure to give his grandchildren their own sukkah, amongst other things, to make sure that Judaism comes alive for them. And if we can think of things, if we're in a capacity to do so, to celebrate Judaism passionately ourselves, or to share it with others, if we're already doing that, this is what the amazing antidote behind amazing antidote to dealing with anti-Semitism in our day and age, the way it's manifested in terms of anti-Israel, which means there are Jewish people that are, so to speak, involved in a cause that hurts us. And with that, we're going to conclude. I'd love to hear any comments, feedback, anything you'd like to share on the topic, and wish you a very good night.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Just regarding the physicality of it, I love these Zoom meetings, and they're very convenient. I can sit at home and Zoom. But when we used to meet at the shul, we had soup.
I know. I was thinking about it today. Like, this is exactly what we're talking about. I was enjoying a piece of chocolate babka. I had some hot soup at home, and I can't share it with you over this computer. So there's perks to in-person Torah study. It's very material. Material, spiritual.
On a less happy note, I frequent a site called Debka, and it's Israeli. It's hooked up with the Israeli intelligence community somehow. But there was an article in there yesterday expressing enormous concern about the peril the Abraham Accords face right now and how apparently the CIA has orchestrated a reunification of all of the Arab intelligence agencies, and they didn't tell Israel they were doing this. And it includes Syria, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, all of them. And they are, and you know, thinking of the Yom Kippur War, I mean, it's a very troubling thing. And I know Blinken is a member of the tribe, so you know there's lots of Jewish members in the Biden administration, but I am very troubled about the foreign policy interaction between this administration and Israel. I'm just going to say it.
Wow. Thank you for sharing.
I'm not inviting any response, but it's just my guts.
Thank you. May God save all Jewish people everywhere from harm. Thank you for sharing.
Rabbi,
Yes, Dahlia.
did you get my message about Poland?
I did. Sorry I didn't have an opportunity to respond.
Did you look it up?
I did not.
They are now arresting, the Polish government are arresting people that provoked and ran the demonstration. They arrested 3 people today
Wow.
because the Polish government will not tolerate anti-Semitism into the point where there are people screaming, kill the Jews, and they're burning historical, items that belong to the Jewish people.
Good. That land has so much Jewish blood spilled into it.
Mm-hmm. But they also have a law that says all Jews are accepted and permitted in Poland.
Wow. Crazy. I'm glad that they took a stand and made sure.
Oh yeah, they are.
It's amazing.
They are.
It's heartening to see that.
It was really scary. I saw it on Yahoo. Yeah. And why do I am concerned with Poland? My grandfather was from Poland.
There's a lot of Polish connection amongst us. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Grandfather from Poland, grandmother from Hungary.
Wow.
History,
and God willing, God's got the ability to figure this out without people getting hurt. So I hope that's what happens. Good night, my friend.